Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schaede. I'm the director of jfit, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. The Zoominar finds you at GPS at UC San Diego. GPS stands for the School of Global Policy and Strategy. It is an international relations and public policy school with a focus on the Pacific Rim. Among our various degree offerings, we have a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization and a Japan language aspect to it. If you're interested in our program offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. At GPS, we have a Japan Center called jfit, where we conduct research, education, information, and connections, create connections across the Pacific. If you're interested in what we do at jfit, please come visit us there at jfit.ucsd.edu. I also have my own website called thejapanologist.com, where you can find some blog and postings, not only from me, but from others as well. Visit there if you're interested. The Japan Zoominar is a weekly affair. We are here every Tuesday at 4:30. And while we're still waiting for participants to log on, allow me to give you a little bit of a forecast. Next week, we're going to stay within the larger theme of geopolitics and talk about the role of Japan and Germany in international military arrangements with my long-term colleague, Alice Krauss here from UC San Diego. After that, we'll look at working women in Japan, followed by an hour of discussing the new biography of Shinzo Abe with Tobias Harris. And we'll not meet on election day, but the week after, I'll have my colleagues Megumi Naoi, Alice Krauss, and Robert Thomas, retired Admiral Thomas, to discuss US-Japan relations after the election. You can read all of this also on our website at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar, where you'll also find recordings of previous shows. Today, of course, I have Professor Andrew Yeo with us, so let me stop my PowerPoints and introduce Professor Yeo. There he is. Good morning, Andrew in the Philippines. Let me introduce you briefly. Andrew Yeo is Professor of Political Science at Catholic University, which is in DC, but today he's in Manila, where he is on a research sabbatical. Professor Yeo is an expert in international relations, East Asia regionalism, US grant strategy, and Korean politics, which we will exploit today because we want to talk a little bit about Japan, Korea as well. Professor Yeo is the author of Asia's Regional Architecture, which was published with Stanford University Press in 2019. He's also written on North Korean human rights, a co-edited book, 2018. He's he's written about a book titled Activists, Alliances, and Anti-US Based Protests, which sounds very interesting. I'll look that up later, Andrew. That was published in 2011. There's also a book titled Living in the Age of Mistrust of 2017. Professor Yeo earned his PhD in government from Cornell University and his BA in psychology and international studies at Northwestern. He's also an active member of Bridging the Gap, which is an initiative to connect academic theory with policy relevance. And he is an active blogger, contributor to Council of Foreign Relations, and many more, and you can see all of this information on his website. Let me cut this short here. Good morning, Andrew, in Manila.
Good morning. So I know many listeners are probably it's still in the afternoon in the United States, but anyone in Asia, yes, it's a good morning here. I really want to thank you for that kind introduction, Ulrike, and also to thank jfit for allowing me to speak a little bit about the topic of the strategic environment in East Asia, Japan, China, Korea, and also talk a little bit about my book. And it's great that you've set up this Zoominar format. You know, we were just chatting before we went live about how it allows us to speak really around the world. So thank you again for connecting me to your program. So in the hour we have together, I'll be focusing on the strategic landscape in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific more broadly. It's somewhat fitting that we address strategic issues on Japan Zoominar as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, I believe, just left Tokyo today, local time, after a meeting with foreign ministers of the Quad in what many see as an effort to counter Chinese assertiveness. Now, of course, the 800-pound gorilla in the room that defines much of the strategic landscape for the three major East Asian countries is the intensifying geopolitical competition between the United States and China. So I'll begin first with I just want to say a little bit about US-China relations, and then I'll talk about the importance and relevance of regional architecture in light of this competition. And then finally, I want to make some brief points about how Japan and Korea have approached their strategic environment. I think it's really interesting that you have these two close US allies in the same strategic environment, but having a slightly different response to how they should address this US-Sino rivalry and, of course, initiate their own foreign policy directives. So with US-Sino relations, we're already seeing a deterioration in this relationship for several years. But of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the downward spiral. The Trump administration decided to use the pandemic as a weapon against China rather than seek cooperation. And I think Pompeo's trip to Tokyo and the meeting of the Quad is a perfect example of the Trump administration mobilizing allies and strategic partners to contain Chinese influence. Now, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but such actions do seem to confirm this growing narrative that there's an emerging new Cold War. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A with you further about whether there really is this Cold War or not. But on the flip side, you have to look at China, and China also has not backed down. Chinese foreign policy has become increasingly assertive the past decade, but has really accelerated under Xi Jinping. And I believe Beijing has hedged its bet on the prediction that US global leadership is on the wane, and it's going to continue to lose support, especially if Trump is reelected to a second term. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has taken steps to consolidate its leadership and power, starting at home, and then in its near abroad, and then finally globally. This includes tightening areas, tightening rule, it's tightening its grip in contested sovereignty areas, including Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and it's asserting its claims over disputed land borders and also in its maritime space. And of course, there's relevance for Japan with the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. So rather than cooperate to address a global crisis, both sides have dug in their heels to escalate tensions, certainly in rhetoric, but also in behavior. You know, it's interesting how the Pope, you know, I'm at Catholic University, so we pay attention to what the Pope or the Vatican has to say, and he kind of criticized the world for not being able to get its act together. So leave it to the church to shame everyone and not being able to cooperate. But that does lead me to the next point they want to address, which is the regional architecture and regional order. And that is the subject of my book that came out last year on Asia's regional architecture. So some will argue that the regional architecture, that is the overlapping network of institutions and alliances that underpin Asia, that it's really built around a balance of power, that it basically reflects geopolitical competition in Asia. So some have interpreted the rapid pace of institution building as an extension of balance of power politics. So regional institutions and initiatives are really reflecting or reinforcing rivalries. So I can give you a couple examples. I know earlier this month, or was it last month, you had Professor Sayuri Katada talk about geoeconomics. And so you have the TPP and the RCEP. Or if you look at these initiatives like the Belt and Road that China has put forth, and the United States Free and Open Indo-Pacific Framework, you know, they're really seen at loggerheads, even though both sides will proclaim that, oh, they're not exclusive and anyone can join. We really see institutions and initiatives that are rising as underpinning this rivalry framework. And, you know, if I were to talk about China, there's already plenty of institutions and dialogues that address security issues, like the Shangri-La Dialogue, hosted every year in Singapore, the ASEAN Regional Forum, or the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meetings Plus. So these are all meetings that relate to security and strategy. But Beijing has put its weight behind other multilateral security forums, including the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. This acronym is CICA, or the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and the Xiangshan Forum. So again, some will see this institution building as, again, just reflecting the rivalry that exists in Asia. But my book, it provides a counter argument to that. I'm a bit more of an optimist, where I believe that the regional architecture can still help maintain and facilitate order. If I were to give an example, look at US bilateral alliances. They provided stability in Asia for over 70 years. And the US-Japan and US-South Korea alliance are two important hubs in this hub and spokes alliance system. And I don't see either countries wanting to relinquish their alliance or mutual defense treaties with the United States. So that's just one aspect of the architecture. But if we were to look at multilateral institutions, we see this complex patchwork of overlapping institutions, and with bilateral alliances, with minilaterals, with multilaterals. And so, if you look at the economic side, people refer to it as a noodle bowl because of all the different overlapping institutions. But I'll refer to it as a complex patchwork of overlapping institutions. But that aligns with assumptions about a liberal international order. That is, there's a set of rules and norms and standards of practice that help facilitate how states should interact with other states. And it also helps highlight when states deviate from accepted rules of the game. So if we look at a place like the South China Seas, there's a reason why a lot of states have a visceral reaction to Chinese incursions of militarization of artificial islands, because there's supposed to be a set of international norms and practices of how you behave in open waters. And that's highlighted because of the existence of these institutions. So these institutions do help address regional governance, from non-traditional security issues to regional trade and economic policy, and to, yes, even regional security. And Japan has played an important role in promoting Asia's regional architecture, both on the security and economic front. I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit later too, but something like the Quad or the free and open Indo-Pacific, those are concepts that were both developed by former Prime Minister Abe and then adopted by the United States. And you also see Japan in a bevy of different trilateral configurations: US, Japan, Australia, India, Australia, Japan, China, Japan, Korea. So Japan is really in the thick of this regional architecture, regional institution building business. And so for me, my hope is, with this growing regional architecture, that you can maintain some semblance of a liberal international order. So architecture should be tied to order based on these institutions and norms, rather than purely just the balance of power. Okay, so finally, I'll just bring up strategic responses and the outlook from Japan and South Korea within their strategic environment in East Asia. Now, all countries have adopted a hedging or an omnidirectional policy to some degree, meaning that you're not there to pick sides. But some countries have aligned towards one superpower more than the other. And if you look at institutions like the Quad or the Quad Plus, so the Quad, the formal name is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, but you have the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. I think Shinzo Abe had once referred to this as the Democratic Diamond. But the Quad Plus, which the US is now trying to promote, would include New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam. Right? I think Vietnam might mess up the Democratic Diamond analogy, but at any rate, the US is trying to expand this configuration. And you see, so on one hand, you see countries that are really aligning to the US, tightening their relationship with the US. I think Japan and Australia are good examples. But then you have other countries like the ASEAN member states, Philippines, or Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea, that are trying very hard not to look like they're taking sides, and they have their own So I'll talk about South Korea, but they're building their own initiatives to create a sense of autonomy. So if I were to mention Japan, what has Japan done? So I've mentioned that they've been leaning towards the U.S. Shinzo Abe had a pretty strong relationship with President Trump, which you have to give him a lot of credit for. But aside from their personal relationship, I think U.S.-Japan alliance, despite Trump's rhetoric about alliances, have held on pretty strong for the past 4 years. And we, of course, have seen Japan pick up the mantle on the TPP. It's kind of lost its momentum. But back in 2016, 2017, we saw Japan pick up the pieces after the U.S. Pulled out. And Japan is also trying to engage more deeply in strategic affairs. One of former Prime Minister Abe's hopes was to return Japan to a normal nation status, meaning revising Article 9, enhancing Japan's self-defense force, not only its capabilities, but its role within the region. But of course, he wasn't quite successful there. But again, it shows how Japan is becoming a much more significant player by building up its own capabilities, but also leading towards the US. And Japan, of course, has been very instrumental in this whole free and open Indo-Pacific strategy or outlook, reaching out to partners like India, the Philippines, building security partnerships. And I just read last month, Japan had conducted its first major arms export sale to the Philippines on the value of somewhere around $100 million. So Japan is doing its part to counter, I think, some of the assertiveness that's coming from China on its own, and also by leaning in towards the US. Now, South Korea has taken a somewhat different approach. And I want to preface by saying that the US-South Korea alliances, it's still very strong. There was also some questions of uncertainty because of statements by Trump, but I think the US-South Korea alliance has weathered the storm. US officials still refer to the US-South Korea alliance as the linchpin. So Korea is the linchpin and Japan is the cornerstone. Americans love coming up with these analogies to show that they're the best buddies of everyone out there. But the alliance relationship is overall strong. So I don't want to give the impression that the US and South Korea are decoupling. But at the same time, South Korea has been much more reticent about choosing sides. They have not embraced the free and open Indo-Pacific narrative. It's just not in their lexicon. And I mean, it might come up, but it's not like Japan where they've adopted a national security strategy around that rhetoric, and same with Australia. Korea is much more sensitive, I think, to Chinese coercion, especially economic coercion, because they're still, in fact, feeling the effects of an economic boycott from 2016 when South Korea deployed a US missile defense system on its territory. And so I think because of that, they're much more worried about Chinese retaliation, especially when they think about things like inter-Korea relations where they need Chinese cooperation. And we've seen South Korea develop its own foreign policy, and much like Japan and the United States, everyone is shifting westward in Asia. So East Asia was always seen as the center, at least for the United States, of Asia-Pacific policy. But now with this Indo-Pacific framing, we're incorporating Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And so the South Korean, the South Korean government, they've put forward this new Southern policy where they focus on ASEAN and India. And again, it's a way of moving forward. I don't want to say hedging bets, but when you see US-China competition and threats of decoupling, at least South Korea can lean in towards other like-minded middle powers such as ASEAN. And so we're seeing South Korea giving the impression of avoiding sides, whereas Japan has made it very clear that they've gone all in with the United States. So I'll stop there, and we're happy to continue the conversation with you. And if listeners have anything to enter in the chat box, we can take up those questions as well.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That's a terrific introduction, and then that's what we're going to do. So feel free to type in your questions. I have prepared a few, and so let me just ask you a very basic question for somebody who's not an international relations scholar. And I had the same question for Professor Katara. Why are there so many alliances? Why this patchwork? And so there are these bilateral ones that some of them are very old, like the US-Japan alliance, which has been there for, well, since 52 or something?
1950 and 1951 and 1954 was when all these alliances were created.
Yeah, and so that maybe was an outgrowth of World War II, but then there are also these newer ones, right? And then there's a Japan-Korea alliance on intelligence sharing, and there's a 3 thing there and a 3 thing there. Why is that? I mean, would it be better to just stop all of this? Is this like our tax code? Like, can we just get rid of all of this and start from scratch and lay this out very clearly and be done with it?
That's a great question, Ulrike. And for those who have tons of time during the pandemic, I would say read my book because I can give you an explanation. But for those who don't have that sort of time, the sort of my elevator response is that, so in Asia, you can do this comparison with Europe because Europe isn't as, it's not as convoluted, the regional architecture landscape. And I do have a paper that I'm writing with a colleague in Europe, Stephanie Hoffman and Graduate Institute of Development in Geneva, comparing these 2 regions. But in Asia, you had these formal bilateral alliances. Those are mutual defense treaties, so those aren't going away. But what you're seeing in Asia is policymakers are creating new institutions, but without getting rid of old ones. And part of it has to do, I think, with the existence of formal alliances, but then you have ASEAN. So you may have heard this phrase, ASEAN centrality, or ASEAN being in the driver's seat. And so ASEAN was really the first multilateral organization out there in Asia. It was created in 1967. But at the end of the Cold War, after this Cold War division dies out, in the security front, you have countries that are saying, well, we have bilateral alliances, but there's issues that can't be addressed just through alliances. So they looked for some kind of space to have multilateral cooperation. And so that's where you have then the ASEAN Regional Forum. And ASEAN really did become the driver of this institution building. But I think one of the reasons why you see a lot of overlapping institutions is because many of these institutions are informal. And so it's easy to create, but then no one really wants to get rid of them. And unlike Europe, where you can probably build more of a consensus, Asia is very heterogeneous in terms of regime type, in terms of the level of economic development. And so it actually works to the advantage of many Asian states to have a multitude of institutions. Kind of one thing works for everyone. But this is the big debate. Some say we have so many institutions in Asia, a lot of them are kind of weak. We're not even sure what they do. I mean, if I mention NATO and the EU, everyone who studies international relations will know what they are. If I say the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum, at least undergraduate students, they might, those are certainly less familiar. So there's a debate whether we really need to have all these institutions when they're not doing that much, versus the other side that says, well, it's because of the dynamics in East Asia, that there's still a lack of trust. There's a diversity of different states, and it's better to have these different forums. So it's the more is better theory versus, we should call them and reduce inefficiency and just have a few institutions. And it's an ongoing debate even among East Asia experts today.
Okay, so there are some obvious questions to ask, and so let me just start us with the very obvious ones, and then leave the complicated questions to ask for the audience. The U.S. elections are coming up. Hiroki has already asked about this, so I'll just ask his question, which is similar to mine, right? So what's your crystal ball there? I mean, what's going to happen if Trump gets reelected, if Biden gets elected, and what does it mean for maybe the triangle that's of most interest to us Japan scholars, which is sort of this Japan, Korea, US thing? Can you talk a little bit about what you think, how the election is going to change the equilibrium that we currently have.
Yeah, very good. And before I begin, please vote for the Americans that are out there. I voted from Manila. It was not an easy process. So if I did it, you can as well too. Again, just for the Americans out there. But with the elections, I mean, of course, this is on the minds of everyone. There's only, what, 27, 28 days left. But in terms of East Asia, I mean, a lot of it has to do with just what we know about Trump's, well, what the past 4 years have been. It's been kind of this lurching in Asia. There's been a lot of questions and lurching back and forth about, how committed is Trump to alliances, or, he really doesn't like multilateral institutions. So what's it mean for various diplomatic initiatives? But on the whole, I would say that the Trump administration has been fairly committed, irrespective of what Trump has said rhetorically. I mean, within a year after his election, you saw, the vice president, the secretary of defense, secretary of state, they all visited Asia. I don't know if you remember in 2017, but Trump had that 12-day tour in Asia. He never went back really for that long of a period in Asia after then. But I do think that the U.S., regardless of who comes into the White House, if it's another 4 years of Trump or if it's Biden, we're going to see a strong Asia policy, but it's really going to have to do with the delivery of that policy. And one of the problems, I think, with the Trump administration is there is a real issue of credibility and of leadership. And I think countries that are concerned about China, like Japan and Australia, or even South Korea, can appreciate U.S. commitment to the region and trying to rally together different countries to prevent Chinese influence from negatively impacting regional actors. But again, he said things about alliances that are somewhat disconcerting. And then if you connect it to global leadership, again, there's U.S. global leadership. There's some concerns with the Trump administration. For Biden, I think we would return to a more traditional kind of approach to U.S. foreign policy. He's been very clear that he wants to restore relationships with alliances, that he's going to place an important emphasis on them, Japan and South Korea in particular. He's also talked about making multilateralism, making diplomacy a much more prominent once again. So I think allies like South Korea and Japan would say I think they could rest easier if Biden were in the White House. But the one kind of irony with Biden is that when it comes to the kind of the biggest question out there for East Asia, U.S.-China rivalry, I mean, we've seen the downward spiral under the Trump administration, but I don't think things would change all that much with Biden. Biden has never been a panda hugger. He's he's pretty hawkish in some areas on China policy. The people around him tend to be strong, hard on China as well too. And ironically, I think if Biden were to come to the White House, it could actually make relationships even more tense, because Trump, who tends to kind of go it alone at times with China, he could at least find some kind of rapport with Xi Jinping from time to time, and he would go it alone. Whereas Biden, if he's going to go multilateral, if he's going to reinforce, let's say, the Quad, or reinforce alliances, but for the purpose of deterring Chinese influence, then that's going to be much more difficult. That's going to probably look much more, I think, threatening or alarming to the Chinese, where it's not really just the U.S. Under Trump, you can see, things might be falling apart, but under Biden, if there's a strong coalition, and if it's directed against China, it's going to be much more difficult for them. So, either way, I think we're going to see tense relations with U.S. China, but with Japan and Korea, I think there can be more stability under a Biden administration than a Trump one.
How stable is the region? I mean, there's a lot of saber rattling and the Senkakus and China building up for sure, right? There's a lot of build up there. Abe trying to build up Japan.
Yes.
Although we have a question of how much did he really do, and does Japan have enough, and did he actually fail? But so leaving Abe aside for a moment, because let's come back to that a little later. How much should we worry? How much are people in Asia worried that China is just flexing its muscles and
That's a fair question, Ulrike, because we've always had these problems like for decades. You know, the Senkaku Diaoyus, the Dokdo Takashima with Korea, Japan, North Korea. These problems they just never seem to die. But I do think if I could give the example of South China Seas, I know it's a little bit outside of the area closer to where I'm in the Philippines, but the incursions have become more frequent. The U.S. has taken much stronger action. The problem is not that I think China, Japan, Korea, none of them want a direct conflict with one another, of course, but it's the problem of misperception and miscalculation. So those risks, I believe, are going up. And when you further militarize the region, I mean, it just makes the specter of conflict much more risky. And so I think that's the concern right there. For the most part, yes, countries will keep a lid on things and the rhetoric may spiral out of control. But the fact that you see more incursions, the Chinese are using the Coast Guard these days to kind of patrol or ram fishing boats. And I think it's really because of the weakness of the Vietnamese Navy or the Philippines Navy that they can't really retaliate. But if you imagine if Japan, let's say that Abe were successful in revamping Japan's role for the self-defense force, and Japan decides to support it has this new security partnership, not new, but it has a security partnership with the Philippines, and it decides to support the Philippines, support the UN arbitration in favor of the Philippines, and then decide to send in some ships to support, to show a sign of force. What would China's reactions be? It would, again, increase the probability of some kind of kinetic action. So I do think because of this rhetoric and because it's almost like they're blinders on when you frame geopolitics in a zero-sum framework, that other sides may not listen to one another, or they may make assumptions, and you might have a miscalculation, and people might or countries might start shooting at each other. So I think that is the concern, and it has gotten. We have entered a more dangerous territory or situation than even 2 or 3 years ago.
So Pat has a question. He wants to give you a little bit of pushback on what you said just through the previous question, which is, isn't a more predictable Biden administration going to provide more stability for the region than a predictably unpredictable Trump administration that would bring much more uncertainty? Right.
So, I mean, it's hard to say. So I on the whole, I agree with Pat there that if I were to say, if it's just about stability and predictability, yes, under Biden, things will be better. But my point was really specific to US-Sino rivalry. And I wanted to just throw that out there because I think the assumption is if Biden becomes president, that things will be resolved and that we can, yes, we understand that there's still tensions with China. It's not just about, individuals and, form, different governments clashing with one another. There's some real, geopolitical, undertones. But I think because Biden, it really has to do with China's perception. If they see Biden as taking action against China, and it's not just on things like alliance relationships, but Biden is much more vocal on things like human rights. So Trump has, I think the State Department has, they've made very clear that what China is doing in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang is, it's against international law. But I think Biden, he may be more forceful than Trump on these issues. And those are the sort of issues, these sovereignty issues that really rile China. And so if Biden is going to put together a coalition of like-minded states to press China on all fronts, on security, on economics, and on human rights, that's where China may feel that it's more cornered. Or who knows? Maybe China will see, well, now that the U.S. and allies have its act together, maybe we should try diplomacy again. So we can't really predict, but I just wanted to throw that out, that when it comes to U.S.-China relations, that things could actually become more tense under Biden. So how close is China really to being a superpower? I mean, I've heard presentations that go this way and that way. Some people say they're already there. It's already is a superpower, a military superpower.
how strong is Japan right now? How much are they already in sort of a chessmate situation where they're actually stabilized because they're both strong, or are they still growing? Or what would have to happen for China to become that superpower thing that we would really worry about?
Right. So, I mean, in terms of power, I mean, if you look at indexes like hard power, military, and economics, of course, the United States is still the largest country in the world, but China is definitely a clear number two. I mean, in terms of its military, in terms of its economics. So yes, I would now label China as a superpower, and it's continuing to rise. It's continuing. I mean, every now and then China will still throw out, oh, we're a developing country, so don't worry about us. Yes, there are parts of China that look like, that are still very poor, and it might identify as a developing country. But China it's not just its current power, but you look at potential projections, and given its population, resources, and even its human capacity. Look at China on the technology front. Yes, it's a superpower. It's going to continue to grow relative to the U.S. Was there another part to that question, or?
That's great. And while we're at this, let me just go down that road a little bit more before we take another turn towards Korea.
Sure.
So what is the rest of Asia thinking about China? In particular, Robbie had a question on the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And I also have a question on the Philippines. So Robbie's question is there still a lot of historical memory that is determining the policies? And I would like also to tie this into the China story. I mean, is there a China angst in the Philippines? Is there are the Philippines suddenly much more positively inclined towards Japan, and how does all of that play out, all these other countries in the region?
Well, thank you for asking that question, since I'm here in the Philippines. And it's interesting because when you look at official rhetorics, if you look at the president, so President Rodrigo Duterte, he's been very warm to China, very friendly. He's allowed Chinese investments to come in. And he's even, often, some have argued he's siding with China over even the United States. But if you look at the rest of the population, if you look at public opinion polls, it's actually very negative to China, and it's gotten worse in the last couple of years. So I'm actually working on a paper with a young Filipino scholar, Michael Gloria, where we look at Chinese influence in the Philippines. And it's one of these puzzles where China has flooded the country with a lot of money and investments. But it hasn't really translated into more support or popularity for the Chinese. Now, because the president himself has been very pro-China, his government has been somewhat lenient. Even on the South China Sea, they've gone back and forth. The UN has supported ruling in favor of the Philippines, but the president at times will say, well, we should just give up the Spratlys to the Chinese because we wouldn't be able to defend ourselves anyways. So he'll make statements like that. But the Philippine military, kind of the traditional Philippine foreign policy types, they're very much wary of China and still very pro-US. So even though China's made a lot of inroads here, that influence hasn't quite translated into widespread support of China. And it'll be interesting to see what happens after Duterte leaves. If we'll see, there's always been suspicion towards China in this country.
So Jacob has an interesting question, still on China actually, as a former student of ours, and he currently works on a US base in Japan. And his question is whether China, if it rises, and as you said, it is a superpower, whether China will make alliances. Is China interested in joining this patchwork that you were talking about earlier, and having maybe some MOUs, as we call it in the university field, memorandums of understanding, or alliances, informal, formal? What is China's behavior in that regard?
Yeah, so when I said that I'm more hopeful about this complex patchwork of regional institutions, it's precisely because China is a member. It's already a part of this regional architecture. You have. And so in terms of, they're not alliances like mutual defense treaties, but you have something like the ASEAN +3. It focuses more on economics, but there are some security defense components built in there, like counterterrorism. So it's the 10 Southeast Asia countries, and then China, Japan, Korea. Or you have the China, Japan, Korea Trilateral Summit. And, you know, they're trying to hold it. I don't think it's going to happen at the end of this year. But again, you see China interacting with Japan and Korea in its own forums and institutions. Now, whether they'll create formal defense alliances like the United States, that I'm going to, I think that's the answer is more likely no. It's because a lot of countries, a lot of states don't like to have those formal relationships. They want some flexibility. And there are not that many partners, I think, that China can really point to. Maybe Pakistan, you know, other autocratic countries may want this, but you know, those institutions mean different things, I think, to autocrats than democrats. So I don't think we're going to see formal alliances, but certainly China is reaching out to other countries to establish things like MOUs. The Belt and Road Initiative, it's just a bunch of bilateral agreements with different countries. On the economic front, but it has strategic implications. And so I wouldn't be surprised if down the road, so there's always debate about whether there's naval bases in Pakistan. There aren't, these are commercial ports, but the Chinese are going to have to protect their assets. If they want to protect their investments, they need some form of security, and what better way to make a commercial port a dual-use military port? And that's going to require some kind of agreement between the Pakistanis and the Chinese at the executive level. So we'll see those, I'm sure we're going to see those kind of agreements, but again, not something I think that would parallel the network of US bilateral alliances, no formal mutual defense treaties.
So let's go to Korea. So Chu Ping is writing from Malaysia, and I actually had a similar question also. Korea, Japan, so complicated. And there's the whole economic part, and now we have Suga-san. So our Prime Minister Suga and Moon, they're going to get along. Are they going, what's going to be different? Is there something new to expect? And what is this Korea-Japan relation going for, do you think?
I mean, so for those that are less familiar, Japan and Korea have had a tense relationship. I mean, Korea was a former colony of Japan. Things were legally, they were resolved under Park Chung-hee in the 1960s. I'm trying to be careful here because I might get angry Korean Korean chat comments from Koreans. But of course, a lot of the issues, like the issue over comfort women or the use of wartime labor was papered over in that agreement in 1960. So then in the 1960s. So now they've resurfaced, you know, really from the 1990s, these historical issues have gained a lot of momentum, and they flare up and down, but I think under President Moon and President Abe, I mean, the relationship really deteriorated. I think last year, 2 years ago, and then last year, I mean, you saw just major anti-Japanese protests, boycotts in Korea. And a lot of this was triggered, in the immediate sense, it was triggered because of the South Korean court's ruling over Japanese conglomerates during World War II that did use Korean labor that was uncompensated. And now the Korean court said that Koreans can seize the assets, the government seized assets of these Japanese companies, because Japan, of course, saying we don't have to pay for them. So that's where things were at. Things that last summer was terrible. It was we kind of hit a low point in that relationship. And then since then, they've kind of stepped back. And you know, Koreans have never had any sort of love for Abe because they see him as someone who's really, he's uncontrite in terms of how Japan, how he and the Japanese view the Koreans. And so I think the biggest difference with Suga is that, you know, Suga is not Abe. So one might argue, well, there could be some sort of reset in that relationship because it's a new leadership. Maybe we should give him the benefit of the doubt. But I do believe that there was a phone call between the two, so they have spoken, Moon and Abe. But last week, Suga and Moon. But Suga made a comment saying that unless the Korean government withdraws its or releases the assets of, I can't remember which corporation it was, but
Nippon Steel, maybe.
Oh yes, yeah, Nippon Steel. There's another company in the lawsuit, but it was Nippon Steel. They said that he said that he's not going to visit South Korea. So
unless that's off the table.
yes, unless
You know,
that's off the table.
we had Professor Davis from Harvard on a Zoominar earlier, you know, like maybe in May, and she laid out how this is a very dicey situation because on the one hand, the Japan side is kind of understandable. They're saying, well, we thought we settled this in 1965, so why you keep bringing this up? And yet Korea is also in a tough situation because the courts have decided this, and you want Korea to be a democracy, and in a democracy, the court makes independent decisions,
right.
And so it's an independent decision. So Suga cannot go to Moon and say fix this because
Yes.
the court has decided this, right? And so we can't just go into another democratic country and say overrule the courts. You know, that's not possible. So it's a very complicated situation, and it's not even clear to me what the solution is to this.
Well, and thank you for correcting me. I got them mixed up with the dates of the ROK Japan normalization and the US-Japan alliance. So it's 1965. But you're right, absolutely right, that it would be, you know, it's the courts themselves that have ruled on this, and Japan can't come in. And that's why Koreans, I think, are even more upset. You know, that's a violation. They would see it as interference in domestic sovereignty. But, you know, for the conservatives, I mean, I think one thing, conservatives in Japan, the LDP, one thing they might look towards is that South Korea, you know, the court system is not like the US where judges sit, you know, in a Supreme Court. So it would be the constitutional court in Korea, but they do change in their composition. And so if there were ever a return to conservative government, I mean, I don't see that any time in the near future for South Korea, but a composition of a recomposition or a reconstitution of the court and the judges could see South Korea rolling back that ruling. But, you know, I'm afraid that by doing so, you're going to really rip apart South Korea between those who, between progressives and Koreas within the country. And so this is where you can see it's not just an issue of international relations, bilateral relations between Korea and Japan, but the domestic politics of this. Domestic politics is, you know, all over this issue. And I think that's why it's so difficult for South Korea and Japan to really touch. And it makes it worse when leaders use, you know, anti-foreign sentiment, in this case, anti-Japan sentiment for your own political purposes. And I think that's what we've seen. I mean, I hate to say this, being a Korea expert, but on the Moon government side, I think it was an opportunity to kind of inflame, you know, to kind of bring a rally around the flag effect. And that's not to say that, you know, Japan, you know, should they make reparations or should they not? Should they do more? I mean, that's on the side of the Japanese. They feel like anything we do will never really satisfy the Koreans. But on the Koreans' part, you know, I think what really inflamed the situation this round was Moon took the issue, but he really pushed it. He really pushed it forward. And I think both sides have. We've seen a cooling off of bilateral relations a bit as they step back. I mean, surprisingly, the Dokdo Takashima, so the island disputes, have always been front and center. You know, a decade ago, but that's kind of died off as well too, as the focus has really been on people, on the comfort women, on the wartime labor issue. And I don't really see them being completely resolved under Suga, but I do think that there may be a way of being able to move forward on security, strategic cooperation, but you know, compartmentalizing the historical issues with the strategic ones. And I'll just end on this note, and maybe it can segue into our next conversation. But from what I see, even for South Korea, they've been reluctant to. I mean, I'll give an anecdote. This free and open Indo-Pacific. You know, when you ask South Koreans why haven't you adopted that narrative when other U.S. allies have? I think the biggest reason is really because they don't want to upset China. But in sort of behind the scenes or close quarters, you might actually hear them say, oh, well, it's a Japanese thing. And so we're not really that privy to it because, you know, Japan came up with the free and open Indo-Pacific, and we don't really want to be a part of that. So I don't think that's the main reason, but you definitely hear that sort of argument being tossed around in South Korea. So that is an issue where historical issues may be affecting a country, South Korea's strategic outlook.
You know, that's also interesting because from a business perspective, the situation is actually much simpler. they need each other. They have these supply chains. They are dependent on each other. And so, let's just trade. And indeed, that's happening, right? So even the Japan, so if you look at the bilateral Japan-China, Japan-Korea, as I looked into that, for my better understanding of the role of Japanese business in Asia, uh, it's much easier. Let's just trade. Right? We have a symbiotic relationship here. Let's, you give me this, I give you that, and so we're happy. But in politics, there's always this thing overhanging the relationship.
Right.
We have a question of can we make it a little bit larger? Can we bring India in, and
Sure.
and also maybe the Asian stance for that matter? So the question is, what is the larger U.S. What's the U.S. grand strategy there? What's the idea here? What does India bring something to the table? Maybe a balancing, soothing sort of function, or is it just making it more complicated?
No, I mean, India is going to bring in another billion, 1.3 billion people into this orbit of, I mean, that's the US thinking or hope that by calling it the Indo-Pacific, you make India much more important. And India is a democracy. And in the past, they've also India has always prided itself on neutrality, and they've vacillated between, they'll cooperate with Russia and China at times, but then they'll seek counsel or advice from the United States. But India-China relations have gotten very tense. We had the standoff in the middle of the summer over the line of actual control, the India-China border in the Himalayas. And the Indian sentiment against China is also very, very negative. And a country that we don't really think of as a major country, the Maldives. I saw this article a couple of days ago in the Nikkei Review, and the Japanese had reported this, that the U.S. and Maldives have signed an alliance partnership. There's a status of forces agreement now. And the U.S. tried this 5 years ago, but the Indians had blocked it because they felt that the U.S. was encroaching and, this is our sort of region and we want to maintain neutrality. We don't want to upset the Chinese. And so they blocked it. They blocked it in the sense that they voiced like really strong concern about it. So the U.S. pulled away. But now the Indians are praising this decision. They're welcoming this partnership between the U.S. and the Maldives. So I think by bringing India into the picture, I mean, I think they can play a key role in, if the goal of the U.S. is to prevent China from, asserting its control or authority within the region. Now, if you're to mention a broad grand strategy, some will say, oh, it's about containing China. And I hope, this is where I think there's a difference between Biden and Trump. I think Biden will try to phrase it as, we don't want to contain or exclude China, even if that's in practice what's happening. But I think rhetorically, they would say something like, we want to maintain an open seas, open relationship, open trade, open diplomacy. And that can only be done through institutions. It can only be done through transparency, no secret agreements. And I think that's the hope of transforming the region. And that's why you can invite a country like India. So it does play an important role in performing that grand strategy, making sure that you're ensuring your own interests, US interests, and also the interests of its allies. But ensuring the interest means making sure you have a region that's open for others and that no one is trying to block, control, or assert their own rules of the game within the region. Of course, that's not how the Chinese would perceive things, but from the US perspective, and being an American myself, I would say that is the broader grand strategy.
So Robbie has a question about this US-China relationship that in a way is affecting all of this, right? So if US and China can get along, then probably the whole thing will stabilize a little bit more. But what he would like to know is what you think about what the chances are. And he thinks that maybe part of the whole US-China thing has something to do with US domestic policies and US social policies and the instability within the US right now. And that's just reflected onto these alliances. So is there any hope even that we could find a new equilibrium and a new stability and, in these alliances without the US fixing, kind of its domestic social policies first?
And that's again where we get into this question of global leadership. And I think in Asia, it hasn't been less of a concern because the US has been present there. And I don't know if Asians are how they respond to things like race relations or human rights, or issues of policing as they might in Europe, which are, in Europe, they're much more sensitive to those sorts of issues. And so, I think when it comes to global leadership, yes, the US has to get its domestic house in order. And for the US, because it really makes the US look hypocritical when they're saying we need to support democracy, we need to promote rights and freedom. I mean, Mike Pompeo loves to use the freedom and the values rhetoric, but when things look messy at home, that's really problematic. And so I do think things have to be repaired at home. Now, can you have this division of labor where things are messy domestically, but you're touting rights and freedom and open seas in another country? For the time being, perhaps, but I think that's China's hope, that you begin to see this distance. China has always tried to distance U.S. allies from the U.S., and that becomes much more easy when you see hypocrisy within the United States between actions and rhetoric. And so if you can have the domestic policies align with its foreign policy, of course, that puts the United States in a much stronger position.
So let me ask one more question and then we'll wrap it up. But so we got this really great question when Professor Katada was here, and it was about the whole trade stuff. But I think for security, the same question could be asked. Who else has Japan's interest at heart? Was the question. So let me tell you what that referred to. Assuming that things are not going, there's China, and China is big and powerful, and the US is not really as powerful as it used to be maybe, and there's some other stuff going on in Asia. And so if Japan needed new allies, or are there natural ones? Are there friends that Japan has around the world that it can rely on? Who are Japan's friends?
Yes, certainly. I mean, Australia and India come to mind right away, and that's why they've had this strategic dialogue between the three countries. And Japan, I think Japan and Australia are really, when it comes to democracies trying to enforce or instill ideas of order and international law, freedom, I think those are the two countries that come to mind. So Australia certainly has Japan's back. There's a lot of potential in Southeast Asia as well too among ASEAN members. So there's always been a relationship between Japan and Australia. There has been for decades, but deepening relationships with individual countries. So I mentioned Japan and the Philippines have strengthened their relationship. They've signed, essentially they become formal security partners, not an alliance, but they have a security partnership that's developed. Japan and Vietnam as well too, because they both have, I think there's a healthy trade relationship, but now they share similar concerns on the security front. So Japan, Vietnam may have potential. And in general, Southeast Asian countries welcome Japan. Japan has been a very big investor within this region. Before the Chinese, I think Japan was the largest investor in the Philippines. And there's a lot of support. There's a lot of scholarship money from the Japanese Ministry of Education that goes to Filipinos. So Philippines have a very positive impression of the Japanese as well too. So they could be seen as a friend. So Japan does have many friends, and it's, I think maybe you have to look outside of its immediate, East Asia, maybe go to Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then further down the Pacific. There are countries that do see Japan as a friend and welcome, would support Japan and welcome welcome even deeper partnerships. So yes, Japan is, I think, in a good place these days.
Yeah, and let me just add to my own question there. I think that this was done very carefully, right? That there are a lot of investments, a lot of economic collaboration, cooperation. That Japan has actually proactively invested in some of these relationships over the years. Right?
Yes.
I think. All right. Well, unfortunately, time is up. Let me thank you, Professor Yeo, for joining us today, bright and early in the Philippines. And I will remind everybody that next week we are seeing, we're staying with this larger topic of military relationships. So this was you. Hang on, I've kind of a little. Okay, before we leave, let me just say, I think about ourselves. We hope that these Japan Zoominars are valuable to you. And it would be wonderful if you could consider supporting this activity. It's not very expensive to do these things, but there is quite some staff support that goes into making sure that I don't push the wrong buttons and that this is advertised properly. And so if you go to our website at jfit.ucsd.edu/support, you will find these Give Now buttons. It's pretty easy. And thank you to those of you who have already supported us. It really means a lot to me that you're here and that you think that what we do is valuable. So please join us next week when Professor Alice Krauss will be here to talk about the role of Japan and Germany in these global military relationships that we started talking about today. So thank you, Professor Yeo, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody. Please stay well and stay healthy. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.